check, camera check. Starting to feel like fall out there finally. We got a little ways to go though in southern New Mexico. It's still 80 degrees, but this morning, well, it is this morning, it's like 8 o'clock. I just got back from my morning sunrise wildlife hike that I go on every morning. And it was 48. It finally dropped below 50. But that's like, as soon as the sun comes up, it's hot again. So we are here this morning for this video because this is surprisingly the most requested video I've had in quite a long time. And that is how I film wildlife, or how do you film wildlife, or how do we film wildlife? How does anybody film wildlife? Well, I can't speak for everybody, but I'm going to go through and I'm going to tell you how I do it. And I'm going to show you some of the ways that I set up my camera and some settings that I like to think about. This is more of the technical side. This isn't like a, you know, if you want to film wildlife, definitely the first thing you should do is like try to find wildlife. So like learn their habits and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But that's a different video. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to try to keep this as non-camera specific as possible, or as camera general. You know what I mean? I realize that everybody uses different cameras and stuff like that, and so the settings are going to be kind of universal. However, I am biased a little bit because I do shoot Canon and I'm shooting on my R5, and I will be mentioning some of the reasons why I shoot on R5. Sorry, my cat is like going crazy at the door because he does not like it when I shut doors on him. Anyways, so I do shoot with an R5, and I'm not saying that it's better than anything else, but I'm saying that it is the perfect camera for me, especially because I do film a lot of wildlife. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of specifics on why I have the R5 and how I have it set up. That way, for a lot of you I know that do have an R5 that haven't tried video before, or if you're serious about doing video for wildlife, maybe this will be a consideration for you. Oh my God, I'm gonna go let him in. So let's go over some, basically, first let me say that you can film wildlife any way necessary, any way possible, and by that I mean like whatever settings you need to do to get the shot. However, when I personally am filming wildlife, I treat it pretty much like I treat anything else in terms of cinematography. And what I mean by that is like things well, the biggest thing really is shutter speed. So there's two different trains of thought or schools or methods or whatever for filming wildlife, reasons why you would film wildlife. One of those is for film purposes, for video purposes, so that you have it. You can watch the video, you can play the video, you can, you know, do all that, edit the video, all that stuff. And the other reason is for these days is for actually pulling stills. And a surprising amount of people ask me about that. I'm not going to go too much into that. I'm just going to mention it real quick that if you want to record video of wildlife for the specific purposes of pulling stills from that, then I will give you some advice. First of all, treat it just like you would the settings if you were taking pictures of said wildlife. And by that I mean, you know, you're going to be focused on probably a faster shutter speed in order to freeze each frame of that, to make sure each frame has the least amount of motion blur possible. And you know, your ISO is going to be whatever your ISO is going to be, your aperture is going to be whatever your aperture is going to be, but the most important bit there is going to be your shutter speed. It's counterintuitive to regular filming for cinematic purposes, which I'm going to get into in a minute. And then the second bit of advice for pulling stills is shoot in the highest resolution possible. So that's going to be 4K for just about everybody, unless you have an R5 or anything like the new R3 that's coming out, which nobody has yet. But if you're watching this in the future and you have an R3, then you'll be able to do 6K. So these are all on, we're talking about doing video for wildlife with a mirrorless or a DSLR. And as far as I know, there are very few DSLRs or mirrorless that can shoot in higher than 4K. There are a couple, like the R5 being the main one, so that I can shoot in 8K, which I do shoot a lot in 8K, and we're going to talk about that too. So that's all I'm going to say about shooting video of wildlife for the intention of pulling stills out. When you pull a still out, the intention is that each frame in the video that you've shot is going to be what you would have shot if you were doing stills. So that's why you want to have that higher shutter speed. All right, so the other thing that I mentioned, of course, is the cinematic style, or not just cinema, we use that word a lot, but just filming wildlife for video's sake. And the two great things about that for me are, one is that I'm a videographer also, so video is awesome, especially video of wildlife. It's not always easy to get video, and these days with social media and everything, video is becoming much more popular, so it's awesome to watch wildlife video. But two, if you're a photographer, one of the things that I love about wildlife that you may want to try it for this reason for video is that if you're going by the principles of cinematography, you're going to be abiding by the 180 rule, which is your shutter speed for video should always be twice what your frame rate is. So basically, what that means is if I'm shooting in 24 frames a second, then I want 48th of a second for shutter speed. DSLR mirrorless do not have 1/48th of a second, but they have 1/50th, so that's approximate. But then everything else, if you're shooting 60 frames per second for slow motion, then you want 120 frames. You want a 1/20th of a second for your shutter speed. And again, DSLR and mirrorless don't have 1/20th, but they have 1/125th, which is pretty close. And then same thing for if you're shooting in super slow motion, you have 120 frames per second, then you want your shutter speed's going to be like 2/50th of a second. So that's what we mean by the 180 rule. It's based in very old cinema. I'm not going to get into the history of it, but basically it is what will create the most natural, what we've come to assume to be the most natural over the last 100+ years of video brainwashing. It will create the most smooth and natural looking to our eyes motion blur. So that rule's bad to follow if you're trying to do wildlife pulling stills from the video, because again, that will increase your chances of having motion blur. However, for video, it's the most pleasing, as I just said, for watching. All of this video that I'm shooting, that I'm showing you guys throughout this entire video, is shot with that in mind, and it has, if I'm shooting in slow motion 120, then my shutter speed is 2/50th. If I'm shooting at 60th of a second, if I'm shooting at 60 frames per second, then my shutter speed is 1/125th of a second. So all of this video that I'm showing you is abiding by the 180 rule for whatever frame rate that I'm filming in. And this video is a mix of all different frame rates, but they're all abiding by that rule. And the beauty of it for me filming wildlife is because a lot of times wildlife is out in the early mornings, in the evenings, and even super late and all that stuff. So filming pre-sunrise and post-sunset, for taking photos, it's difficult because you want that higher shutter speed, which means your ISO is going to be cranked up, which means your image is going to be grainy, that kind of stuff. But when you're filming, you get the chance to lower that. If you're abiding by the 180 rule, then if I'm filming at 60 frames a second, even, which is slow motion, then I can film at 125th of a second, which a lot of times when you're just taking pictures of wildlife, you're going to be taking pictures with much faster shutter speed than even that, especially with the longer lenses, because with longer lenses, when you're doing photography with wildlife, you generally want to shoot at a shutter speed that's at least what your focal length is. So in this case, I'm shooting on my R5, with the 1 to 500. If I'm at 500 millimeters when I'm taking a photo, I typically want to be at least 4 to 500, 4 to 500th of a second to get that, to freeze that action, to freeze the animals. But I don't have to worry about that when I'm doing video. And if I'm shooting just regular 24 frames a second, then that means I can get away with a 50th of a second, and that will really lower my ISO and really help out the image quality of the video overall. So that's another thing that I really love about doing video for wildlife, especially in those hours where it would be a little bit more difficult to get decent photos. Okay, so let's go over some settings real quick. Take this off for a second. So let's briefly talk about, I'm just going to go ahead and get this out of the way. That way this camera specific stuff, I just don't want this video to seem like I'm pushing the R5 or I'm saying that everybody has to have an R5 to do video, because obviously this is a very expensive camera and you don't need it to do video of wildlife. I shot wildlife for many, many years with, you know, Canon 60Ds, 70Ds, 80Ds, 7Ds, 5D3s, 5D4s, you know, 1D series, all kinds of different stuff I've used, and I've gotten great results from all of it. But let me just say that if you're considering wildlife for stills, obviously, you know, the R5 is amazing. But let me just show you one button that just made everything for me as a hybrid shooter. I constantly am switching extremely quickly between taking burst photos of wildlife and video. This button right here, right there, that is the MFN button. That's the multifunction button, and it's right next to the trigger button. And the beauty of the R5 having this electronic top menu thing is that it allows me, because I don't have to turn the mode dial, it allows me to assign this multifunction as my video mode. So you may be saying, a lot of you know that with the Canons, they have it to where you can just hit the record button even if you're in stills, and it will record. And that is for a lot of other cameras too, not just the R5. So I actually have it set to where the MFN button will turn on my video mode. Now, the typical video mode that I shoot the most in for wildlife, just to be on the safe side for everything, is I shoot in 4K, 60 frames per second, and I have it at, again, abiding by that 180 rule, I have an 1/125th of a second shutter, and I have an auto ISO in manual mode, so that way I can change anything if I need to, but those are my default settings: 1/125th of a second, 4K, 60 frames a second, auto ISO. All I have to change then, if I want to deal with the light changing, is my aperture. So that's what the MFN button is, I have set up for it. If I hit that and I'm in stills, it will switch straight to video, and it will switch straight to video for those settings. I'll be ready to roll. I can then just hit the record button and go to town and film whatever wildlife action is happening in front of me. So the other thing that I did that is super powerful for me is, so we have the MFN, we have the multifunction button assigned to my regular 4K 60, and then so all I have to do when I'm in stills mode is click that and then hit record, and then I'm recording away. If I'm in stills mode, then, and I want something else, but I don't want to change those settings, then I programmed it to where C3, so Canon has it set up to where when you hit the record button right here and you're in stills mode, then that will engage its C3, its custom 3 video, and by default that's like 1080, 24, I don't know what, by default it sucks. So what I did is I went into the video mode and I programmed this. I got the settings set up for 8K in my user profile that I set for my flat picture style and all of that stuff, and I got the shutter speed and everything, the auto ISO, and 8K all set up, and then I saved those settings to register them as my C3. So every time I am in stills mode and I hit the record button, just the straight video, it will go straight, it will immediately start recording in 8K at the settings that I have set up for that. So that's really powerful. That's 2 different video modes that I can hit with 1 click of a different button. That right there for me as a hybrid shooter is just so invaluable. I can't tell you, like the reasons why I would shoot 8K, and I've been over this before, and I might make a full video on this, but for wildlife is obviously it's future proofing. Like that's a little overkill, right? But the main reason is because I can crop in. So even if I film everything else in 4K and then I'm working in a 4K timeline, I'll still be able to crop in 100% on an 8K to match that 4K and be even closer to wildlife. And I do that a lot, surprisingly, and it makes a huge difference in my ability to either move things around and recompose in post, or to just crop in and get that much closer to the wildlife without having to get closer. So I love 8K, but I don't want to always shoot in 8K. I don't want to default to 8K because that's a lot of video files and that's overkill even for me. So having that set up as my secondary but still easily accessible is the best thing that I have had. It's been a game changer for me since I've had the R5 because of that. I will say that on other cameras, on other Canons like the 1D series and the 5D3, 5D4, I don't remember if the 5D3 had it. I had the 5D3 for a long time, but the 5D4, the 1DX2, I know both of those cameras had the switch back here by your thumb where you can switch between stills and video, and then the record button was right in the center of that. So that style is great, and I'm very happy to see that Canon has put that back into the new R3, which is coming out as of the time of this video. So I'm pretty excited about that. There are other camera companies out there who have similar setups, who have the ability to switch between stills and video easier than going into the menus and having to do it like I did back in the old days with my older cameras, like my 1DC and that beautiful dead paperweight sitting right there. The stuff like that. So and with the R6, so with the R6, there is this mode dial right there, and because of that mode dial, you can't switch back and forth like you can on the R5, and that really bums me out because I love the R6. However, what you can do is do what I did with the R5, is it has the record button. So if you have an R6 and you want like super fast switching without having to turn the mode dial, then you can program the record button in your C3 settings to whatever video you want, video settings that you want. So if you're in stills, you click that record button, it will immediately start recording in your C3 whatever those settings that you just set up for are. And you can do that with a lot of different cameras. You can do that with a lot of Canon cameras, and I'm fairly confident you could do it with like some Sonys and Nikons, having it to where there's some button on here that if your camera allows it, you should definitely check for that to see if you can program it to be able to switch to video like as fast as possible. Like that's the goal when you're a hybrid shooter, is switching to video as fast as possible. That way you're not missing out on any potential action. All right, so those are settings. Those are kind of external settings, and let's talk about some internal settings now. Let's talk about some different things. So we've gone over, like I said, I typically shoot in manual mode with auto ISO. For me, that's super important because the light's changing, the angles are changing, whatever. I have accepted that my ISO when I'm doing wildlife is going to be as high as it needs to be. So that's just something, if you're really picky about super perfect ISOs, then probably wildlife isn't for you. But I've just come to terms with auto ISO as my friend. I would rather have a high ISO and get the shot than have a severely underexposed and not get the shot. Let's talk about autofocus for a second. So that's the next most important thing when you're filming wildlife. I will say I am spoiled with the R5 and the R6. They have an amazing autofocus system, and then they have the animal IAF, which it works incredibly well once you have it set up. And I have a whole video dedicated on how I set up the autofocus for wildlife for both stills and video. It's the same, so you can check that video out. I'm not going to go over that. Let's just suffice it to say that I have a dual back button focus setup. So that being said, usually it works pretty well, but there are still a lot of times where it will just lose something. So that's when I change either my tracking sensitivity, and again I have another video on that. But if you find your AF bouncing around on you a lot, especially if you don't have like an R5 or an R6 or a Sony, like the A1 or something, and even if you do, even with those, it's not perfect, and sometimes it will drift. Sometimes it will just grab some random stuff and say, hey, this looks way cooler than that animal, because it doesn't know what you're filming. Even though you may be in animal IAF, like, it still doesn't know, and sometimes it still just goes and grabs a branch or something that moves in front of it or whatever. In those cases, I will definitely have like a manual. I will definitely do a manual override and either get it back to the ballpark so it can grab onto it again, or a lot of times, especially when I didn't have the R5, when I shot with my older cameras like 1DX2 and 5D4 and stuff, I would still shoot in manual autofocus, and that's a skill in its own in learning. And it can sound scary, and it is, especially if you have a smaller animal or if you have an animal that's constantly moving back and forth towards you. But if you have an animal that's moving to the side, or that's not moving very much at all, and you need to get through some trees or over a bush or whatever, manual autofocusing can definitely be your friend. So don't be afraid to, if you're because autofocusing, as brilliant as it is and as wonderful as it's progressing, it can still, in wildlife, it can still really ruin your shot. So I always have a habit of, my hand is always right here, and I'm ready at a moment's notice to flip that switch and go straight to manual, and then again right there, ready to focus. So just don't discount manual focus, even if you have something that you think is amazing like the R5 or the A1 or something. They just don't, when the autofocus fails you, just be ready, have that mental thing, for the mental note to be ready to switch to manual, and that will save you a potential lot of grief. Going along with shooting in manual, or just shooting wildlife in general, this is kind of counterintuitive to having the best ISOs, but I will a lot of times shoot not wide open, even if it's getting darker outside, and like I will try to stop down to like f8 or f11, especially during the daytime, and that's just going to help with, just like in stills, it's going to help more of the animal be in focus. So think about that. That's again why I shoot in manual mode with auto ISO. All I've got to do, and again, when you're shooting in video mode, if you're shooting video for video, like I said, following those cinematic rules with the 180 rule, you're not going to be messing with your shutter speed. At least I don't. I know that I set my shutter speed to whatever double my frame rate is, and I leave it at that. I don't change shutter speed. So that means you're in manual mode, your shutter speed is set, your ISO is in auto. All you got to worry about is your aperture, and being able to do that with your thumb right there. Super easy. So if you want more in focus, then definitely have that mindset of dropping your aperture or stopping your aperture down. That is possibly going to make your ISO go up, but at the expense of your autofocus wonking out. It may get more of the animal in focus, and that is definitely a positive. All right, so let's go over a couple of accessory things to think about when shooting wildlife. So First of all, a lot of people ask me about tripods. I personally don't actually usually use a tripod for filming wildlife. Surprisingly, I film all handheld with something like this. This is my main setup. I also have this guy, which if you see my channel, you know I've done quite a few videos with and about. That is my 800 millimeter f11. So there's a lot of pros and cons to that lens. f11 sucks. It sucks bad, but it makes up for it because that is super light. It's image stabilized, and it's extremely affordable. So I've gotten a lot of good wildlife footage with that lens simply because I can sit there and hand hold with that lens all day long, just like this 1-500. If you haven't seen it, I did a full review on it. It is my favorite lens of all time. It is a little bit heavier than that 800, but it is super light, all things considered. Like, I don't shoot with big primes anymore. I don't shoot with those big 600, 500 millimeter f4s because, for one, they're super expensive, and for two, they're just really big, and the military was not good to my body. I have a lot of broken things, especially up in my shoulders and my knees, and you know, the point is, I like shooting handheld. I like having the ability to go super light. It allows me to walk farther. It allows me to stay out longer, and it allows me to be more versatile. A lot of times tripods will slow me down. So I'm not saying that that's the best for you. If you work well with a tripod and you have big, heavier lenses, when we're doing wildlife, then I would suggest looking into a very good fluid head or a very good gimbal head, something that you can move around very easily that won't cause, you know, jitters like that. Something that promotes smooth motion. Monopod, same thing. As long as your monopod is flexible and it's not causing jittery motion when you're moving it around, then those may help you. And you know, the downside to shooting handheld is that even with the amazing image stabilization, the IBIS and the IS and the lenses and stuff that I use, you still do get a lot of movement, and I'm having to stabilize that in post. But that's just something that's a sacrifice that I'm willing to deal with because I don't mind putting the time in post. So if you want the smoothest thing possible, get a tripod. If not, then work on your hand holding technique, you know, elbows in, bracing it. The thing that I love about shooting with mirrorless is that you can use the viewfinder as an extra support on your face, and you can film looking through the viewfinder, and that will give you that extra bit of support, which is fantastic. But if not, you can have the flippy screen out, and you can, you know, elbows in, real nice and firm, good grip on the bottom here. If you have a tripod collar, that's really great for firm. I have pretty big hands, so I'm able to palm the tripod collar and then still have my fingers on each side of the focus ring or the zoom ring. So like Brittany, my wife, she can't do that. You know, her hands are about this big. So, you know, if you have smaller hands, it's a little bit difficult. You can move the tripod collar if you don't use it. You can swing it up. Then, you know, you'll have your hand down here. Either way, having that support on the lens is really important. Just be mindful of if you have a real sensitive focus ring or a real sensitive zoom ring or something. Be mindful that you're not twisting that accidentally and either changing your focus or your zoom or whatever. So those are just a little bit of hand-holding tips. The next most important thing for me, it's not always important to a lot of people, but again, if you're taking the video seriously, putting together a decent video, you're going to want some decent audio. And it's not always possible, but you know, to get the actual animal making a noise. But sometimes, well, most times when I'm filming, I want the general ambience of an area as well. If there's other birds going off in the background, if there's other, you know, maybe the elk I'm filming is not bugling, but maybe there are bugling elks in the background, then I'm at that point, like, that's when you want good audio. So for my audio recently, I've been using this, and this is a windscreen. Well, this is a regular shotgun mic. This particular one is by Deity, and they sent me this a while back, and I've been using it. So this isn't sponsored in any way, shape, or form. These are the types of things that I use. You can use any type of microphone. I've really been happy with the audio quality of this. This particular one is, one of the things I love about it is that it just goes right on to your hot shoe of your camera. And this one, it does not have a battery pack. So as soon as you plug it in, it's powered by the camera. And I love that because I don't have to worry about my battery dying on my mic or charging it or anything like that. So that just is plugged in right there, and there's my mic. So it's, comparatively speaking to most mics, it's very non-intrusive, and it doesn't add any sort of real weight. Like, this thing is almost weightless. So in terms of, you know, my portability, how I like adding this type of microphone is not a problem at all. So there are lots of other mics like this that are very similar. You know, obviously the Rode, I used the Rode Video Mic Pro, or I used the Rode Video Micro for very long time, like at least the last 4 or 5 years. And I probably still have one laying around somewhere. And then I used the Rode Video Mic Pro for a long time until that died. But the Video Mic Pros, any like Deity has one. They have their I think it's their D3 Pro or something like that. But those ones are more directional in their shotgun mount, and they're also battery powered. So I really like stuff like this, the Deity D4 and the Rode, and you know, I think there's let's see, like, yeah, I mean, I have, see what I mean? I have a ton of microphones. This one is a Shure microphone, very similar. The dead cat, the windscreen is super important, so you can take that off, and there is the microphone right there. So that is how tiny it is. The windscreen is really important for me because, you know, I'm a YouTuber, and I'm always out, and I live in New Mexico, and it's always windy here. So having, you know, something to filter out that wind and all of that stuff, it does a great job. I will say that this is on-camera solution, and on-camera solution is not always the best because your camera's built-in preamps, on no matter what camera you have, they're crap. You know, unless you have a really good cinema camera that has the XLR, and even a lot of cinema cameras still don't have the best preamps. I am a bit of an audiophile. I have an audio engineering background as well. Clearly, I am also a musician. So audio is always in the forefront of my mind, and I realize that not everybody is like that, but I will tell you that when you record audio into a camera, it has its preamps, and they're not great. They're noisy. The noise floor is all over the place. It's not a lot of technical things. So plugging a better mic into it, like even like this, is great, and that will definitely help. But if you want the best audio possible for recording natural sounds and environments and stuff, get yourself something like a little Zoom. I've got a bunch of them. I've got like a Zoom H1 and the Zoom H6 or something that you can plug in really good mics also, but they have much better preamps, or a Tascam or something. Those are separate video recorders, and those you can place around. You can put different types of microphones, because this also, this shotgun style mic is not always optimal. Like if you're shooting, you know, they're going to be more directional. So if you're trying to get sound from all around you, you're going to want a stereo mic. And Deity has those, Rode has those, Sennheiser has, I mean, everybody has all of these different types of mics. So it's not always, it's not, you know, brand specific, it's type specific. So just pay attention to the cardioid or supercardioid and the mic patterns and all of that stuff. If you want something that is more all-encompassing, then you're going to want a stereo mic. But I've just found that these do a really good job, surprisingly, filtering out wind in the field and picking up, because typically if I'm shooting in front of something in a forest or whatever, this mic does a pretty good job at just picking up that ambience, and having that ambience is, to me, is pretty important. And then going along with that, just make sure that in your camera, if you're focused at all about audio, if you care at all about the audio, make sure that you have the automatic gain control. If your camera has that, make sure that it's turned off. So that will basically try to control the gain or the volume levels of your mic automatically. So if things are quiet, it's going to pump that gain up so that it can pick up the sounds. And if things get real loud, it's going to try to drop that gain to deal with the loudness. However, when things happen, when things fluctuate really fast, the automatic gain control will just mess up your audio so fast, and it will be absolutely horrible. So just turn that off and then do the audio controls manually. When you plug a mic in, then you can, like in the Canon world, I can go into my Q menu, which is just one click right here, and then I can, with the either on the touch screen or with the scroll wheel, I can control my audio, and I'll be able to have it set at whatever I want, whatever levels that I want. And if it's quieter in the forest, then I can. And if it's quieter in the forest, then I can crank it up. And if I'm somewhere loud, like near a road or something, I can turn that down a little bit and hopefully filter out some of that non-wanted ambient noise. All right, so that's audio. I think that's kind of all I want to talk about the audio, because I realize that's a whole separate thing. And I realize that audio is kind of scary to a lot of people. So just get yourself a decent little mic like this Deity. I'll have the link down below. Anything in this ballpark will work that looks like that sounds like that. It's like 50, 60 bucks, something like that. And non-powered, you're not going to worry about anything. Just plug it in, set your levels, and get the best audio that you can. So that's typically my audio setup for run and gun wildlife in the field. Obviously, if I'm doing something a little more high-end, for clients or whatever, then I'm going to take audio a little more seriously. But I will, even if I have a hand recorder and a big stereo mic and I've set it somewhere or whatever, even if I'm doing all of that, I will always have one of these on my camera when I'm doing video as a secondary, as a backup, because that's the other thing, is redundancy is your friend, especially when it comes to audio. And, me being a YouTuber, that's really important as well. But, just in general, just for filming wildlife, I'm always going to have this on there as a secondary thing, even if I'm got the fancier recording methods or mics going on. All right, well, this video went way longer than I thought. I mean, I knew it was going to be a long video because this is pretty in-depth. So I try to give you guys as much information as possible. But I'm going to wrap it up here because it is definitely second breakfast time. It is 9:30, and I started recording this video at 8 o'clock this morning after I got home from my wildlife-ins, and that is just ridiculous. So I have a lot of editing to do. I have a lot of second breakfast to get to. If you guys have any questions about the settings or the way that I do things, or anything concerning doing video for wildlife that you want to know, leave those in the comments below and I will definitely answer them. And if I get enough, like always, I will probably make another video on it. Huge thanks to you guys if you made it this far. I super appreciate it. I hope that helps you get an idea for how I do things and for how maybe you could do things too if you want to start filming wildlife. Hit that like button for me if you can, because that definitely is the best way you can help out my channel. Like I said, this isn't sponsored by Deity or Canon or anybody else. So if you want to help me out, then hitting the like button and doing things like checking out my channel memberships, my preset packs, all of that kind of stuff. Fall's coming up. I have a great fall preset pack that I use a lot and I love. And you guys apparently have loved it too, so huge shout out to everybody who's supported me that way. Do workshops, check that kind of stuff out. Those are all the best ways you can help out your fellow YouTube creators like me. Okay, second breakfast time. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. I'm starving, and my cat is still freaking out.